Okay, I think we're ready. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. Today, we're going to be going over a policies and best practices kind of guide sheet that I put together for everybody to use to kind of help navigate these changes that are going on in our industry, not only with the practices, but forms. Um, so I'll share my screen here in a bit and we'll get into that. But also, we're going to talk about some procedures to do with the cooperating broker compensation forms, as well as this new Bright subscriber form, the disclosure that has to be filled out and signed by all your clients, whether they are buyers or sellers. So we're going to get into all that. I'll start here by sharing my screen, and then we can go over our policies and best practices. So I'll start reading, starting at the top here. As of August 17th, 2024, the NAR settlement has dictated some rule and form changes within our industry. The First Advantage policies and best practices are designed to help guide you through this transition. Compensation offerings are no longer allowed in Bright MLS or any other website platform with an IDX feed from Bright MLS. There is to be no verbiage in the listing photos, agent public remarks, showing time, winks, or nudges. No communications about compensation can be done through showing time or any other software platform, again, with an IDX feed from Bright MLS. This is the main change associated with the NAR settlement. Cooperating compensation remains legal and lawful. However, communication of compensation is not permitted through the MLS or any other software with an IDX feed. PAR has amended, obviously, as we've gone over many times, many of its agreements and forms. The new forms were published on August 1st and went into effect on Saturday, the 17th. If you currently have clients under contract, as we talked about again before, you're going to need to implement this Notice of 2024 Policy Changes, or the NPC form, to disclose to your clients all the changes that have been made in the industry and forms. Moving down here, starting 8/17, you will now need to have a written agreement. This agreement does not have to be a PAR agency agreement, but you need an agreement in writing signed before showing a consumer a property. However, listing agents may still hold traditional open houses because they represent the seller and there is no relationship established with the buyer. Also, as a listing agent, courtesy showings in which you allow a represented buyer, their agent may have a situation where they can't show the property to look at the listing. Those situations are acceptable and do not require a written agreement with that buyer. Scooting down here, buyer agency agreements and dating contracts. The second large change stemming from NAR legal settlements is you will not be allowed to accept more commission than the specified amount in your buyer agency agreement. For example, the listing agent offers, we're using 25% here, an ambiguous number, so we don't insinuate any set industry standards that never were a part of the business to begin with. They were always negotiable. But listing agent offers 25% cooperating compensation, and your buyer agency agreement allows you to only collect 24.5%. You cannot accept the additional 0.5% being offered as commission. The excess is negotiable and can be requested as seller concessions in some circumstances. Obviously, if you're amongst competition, that may not be possible. As a listing agent, in instances where buyer's agent is contracted for less than what is being offered and no seller concessions are negotiated, you as the listing agent are going to have to decide whether or not you're going to reduce your total fee to credit the seller for the 0.5% or retain the amount that you're entitled to as defined by your listing agreement. In Brett Woodburn's opinion, as he talked to us at the country club, there are situations in which buyer's agents can justify an increase to their fee agreement to accommodate for a buyer's agent bonus or an increased fee. The point to keep in mind, though, when you're negotiating a buyer agent bonus or increased fee agreement, these negotiations, these types of offers, there has to be consideration for that increased fee. Additionally, that consideration in that increased fee must be negotiated and encompassed in a written agreement for your protection. We're working with him. As he mentioned, he's already done so in certain instances where he's put pre-printed language together that has fillable sections. We're working with him to get that legal verbiage that we can put into our buyer agency agreements in acceptable situations so that you can amend them for fee increases. Additionally, in our conversations with Brett, we discussed how dating agreements, written agreements with buyers for showing properties will likely become popular. These agreements may or may not contain an upfront fee for showing properties. Either way, they will establish the required written relationship to show a listing to a buyer. We are contracting him again, not only to do the pre-printed verbiage rather, but to put together one of these quote unquote dating agreements for First Advantage's use. Again, Brett Woodburn's opinion, if you're using a dating agreement involving a fee for showing listings in conjunction with transitioning that agreement into an exclusive buyer agency agreement when the consumer is ready to purchase a property and make an offer, we advise that you consider striking the words in that exclusive buyer agency agreement in paragraph 2B. This is located in line 39 of that agreement, and this will allow you to legally and lawfully collect both fees that are specified both in the dating agreement and the exclusive buyer agency agreement. If you have any questions with this, obviously reach out to one of us and we will help walk you through that scenario. This is just a general reminder that you may not collect more than what's specified in those agreements unless they're amended, obviously for certain situations. But if you do not want to work for free, make sure these agreements are properly filled out. Make sure you're diligent about what you're putting in there and mindful that you're filling out the form in its entirety. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out to one of us. We'll move on here to the listing contract. So in paragraph 7, the main change, seller concessions has been added to allow sellers to offer concessions in Bright MLS. If you're unsure how to fill out the broker fee, cooperating compensation offered to brokers working with buyers, and the seller's concessions based on the negotiations you had with your sellers. Again, we're here for you. Reach out to us. We'll help walk you through it. The cooperating compensation remains lawful. Again, you can't put it in the MLS or anything with an IDX feed. So I put together an example scenario of how you might better explain or give some rationale to a seller for justifying why it might be in their best interest to allow you to offer cooperating compensation to a buyer's agent. So let's look at this example on a $300,000 listing. The typical rule of thumb historically has been that buyers face approximately a 6% out-of-pocket cost in addition to their down payment for things like, obviously, lender origination costs, transfer tax, title, insurance, etc. In this scenario, with a $300,000 price point, that would equate to $18,000. Considering conventional financing, 80/20 loan, their down payment would be $60,000. And now let's assume that the buyer has to pay their buyer's agent. And again, we're using a large number here, 5%, so we don't insinuate any set industry standards. That buyer's agent fee would equate to $15,000, making the grand total out-of-pocket costs for this transaction on a $300,000 home $93,000 for conventional financing. Obviously, this is a big expense. Here's a little explanation to go with this scenario. Without paying a fee to the buyer's agent, buyers are already faced with an expensive transaction to obtain home ownership. Adding cost on the buyer side of the transaction puts home ownership out of reach for a large demographic of buyers who can afford the monthly payment but do not have the necessary funds saved up for the out-of-pocket money to proceed with the transaction. Home prices are, like any free market, dictated by supply and demand. Supply remaining the same, limiting the amount of buyers who can compete on your property. Demand negatively impacts the sales price of your home. Ultimately, the more buyers you have interested in competing for your property will yield the highest price. So, additional explanation, rule of thumb: with current interest rates, buyers' monthly mortgage payment increases by around $7 a month per $1,000 financed. There are demographics in which buyers are willing to go up, potentially in competition, $20,000 more in price, because it only increases their payment by around $140 a month. However, these same buyers may not submit an offer at all if they don't have the additional $15,000 to pay their buyer's agent. Again, in this scenario where the seller or listing brokerage wouldn't be offering any cooperating compensation. This case, this scenario would result in a $5,000 net loss to the seller because this buyer wouldn't compete and go up $20,000, which is obviously $5,000 more than the cooperating compensation. Furthermore, the buyers may take their spending power and compete and offer on comparable home in which the listing broker is offering cooperating compensation, which makes the property more affordable and attainable to the buyers. Now, I've had some people not in love with this graph I put together, and I may amend this at some point, but I like the graph. It helps further illustrate the concept, representing a decrease in supply or demand in a free market while supply remains the same. But this just spells out, again, what I was talking about in the earlier explanation, in that when you decrease the quantity of demand, so this is the original demand, decreasing the quantity, you move back on the x-axis here, your new demand ultimately results in a decrease in price. Price occurs where the intersection or equilibrium point between supply and demand. And conclusion: maximum demand exposure in the number of buyers able to compete for your property will yield the highest price. Again, I just put this verbiage together for your use. You can use some of it, all of it, none of it. But I just, wanted to have this at your fingertips in your, use in conversations with your sellers if they are asking why they should do that. Here's an important one we wanted to get into today because we've already ran into scenarios where you got to be paying attention to the details and understanding what's going on and follow the appropriate procedures when using this cooperating broker compensation agreement. The CBC was revised. The new verbiage states that the listing broker agrees to pay a cooperating broker who is the procuring cause of, this is important, a successful purchase transaction. In the event the seller breaches contract, it is probable that the compensation is not earned and due and payable because of a non-successful purchase transaction. Brett Woodburn brought this up in our meeting, and he recommended our agents consider using the previous CBC version, especially as a buyer's agent, to protect themselves from these types of scenarios. I've already downloaded the old CBC and uploaded that to our Zip Forms global templates. We're working on getting Lone Wolf / Zip Forms to make this a working document so that you can make it fillable and type in those pre-printed areas. I don't know if we have that done yet, but it's in the works. So keep an eye out for that as well. That will be in our First Advantage Forms library underneath Zip Forms. So moving on here, First Advantage asks for a signed copy from the listing agent of the CBC if any cooperating compensation is being offered on your listing. This will be distributed by our office admin to the buyer's agent when showing notifications come through. Hopefully this, relieves some of the burden on you guys and gives the buyer's agents notice that you have cooperating compensation that you're offering. As a buyer's agent, you will want to have a fully executed CBC prior to ideally showing the home, but especially before submitting an offer. If you don't have something fully executed before submitting the offer, and time is of the essence where there's multiple offers, it's advisable that you write in the cooperating compensation in paragraph 3A with the newly revised standard agreement of sale. Getting a little further into this paragraph 3A in the agreement of sale, it's also important to note that they they put the words in addition to any cooperating compensation agreement negotiated between the brokers, whether it's the CBC or some other agreement. So you got to know how these two things work and play in tandem. Obviously, if you don't have any written agreement, you're going to want to protect yourself with if you verbally communicated, yeah, we're offering X as cooperating compensation, you're going to want to use 3A to make that a written agreement within the agreement of sale. But if you already have a CBC or an email or text or something that you sent out as a listing agent to a buyer agent in writing, and then the buyer's agent sends you a contract with an additional whatever X percentage agreement in the agreement of sale. Reminder, this is in addition to those prior negotiations and agreements that you have in writing. So keep an eye out for that. Uncle Tim, Kong, anything you want to add to that? Because I know this is something we wanted to touch on and talk about these procedures because we're running into questions and these scenarios already.
There's been a lot of confusion on how to handle some of these things, whether or not it's in the form of a concession or commission. Is there anybody in the last week that has run into this that wants to talk about what happened to them that we can talk about, or I can bring up an example. So is there anybody, first of all, that has a question that we could answer first before I bring up my example?
I don't have a question, Tim, but I ran into this. I was having this conversation with Seth yesterday. I had 14 offers on my listing over the weekend, and so many of the agents wrote, well, I shouldn't say so many. There was a couple out of the 14 that wrote in the commission on the contract. And when I emailed them back and said, hey, your commission on the contract, I'm offering co-broke, which you already knew. Are you asking for double the commission? And they all responded, no, my broker says that as long as it's on the contract, that I don't need a co-broke. So I didn't get into arguing with them over it, but these are actually one of them was an agent that's probably been in the business longer than you, Tim. So just something to watch out for. It wasn't an offer it wasn't the top offer, so I didn't worry about going into it. But if it would have been, I don't know what would have been different for that one. But there was a couple of them that wrote in commission, or the way they did the co-broke and the contract, it was like count like not the same. So,
and that's a great example. And Kong and Brooks, we actually never thought out that example. Okay. And what I'm saying is that if there was a compensation co-broke form offered and it was signed by the buyer's agent, and then they put the in addition on, that could be double. But if there wasn't a compensation form offered and they put that in there, what are your feelings on that, Kong?
Well, remember, the co-broke form is between co-brokes. Who signs the co-broke form? Certainly not a client. Neither the buyer nor seller signs it, okay? Because
Right.
it's coming from the listing brokerage, which we already got from the seller via the listing agreement. So when you put it on the contract, now it's between the buyer agent and your seller.
mm-hmm.
You're out of the picture, listing agent. So you got to think and comprehend that that's what's going on. Is if it's on the contract, the buyer agent is asking for it with the buyer directly from the seller. Whereas the co-broke, the buyer agent is asking for it from the listing agent.
Correct. That's a great way to explain it.
But if you're on the other side, so me getting that from this agent or these agents, I could easily say, okay, like my commission, I can reduce my commission that I signed the listing contract with you, seller, and I can reduce that. And then this is what we're paying this agent so that does. But I also don't have to do that. So that net to the seller as a buyer's agent would be a lot less, and your offer would not be as strong if the agent already has a co-broke and you choose not to sign the co-broke. Agreed. But if we talked about this, and this is what Brett Woodburn said, that, if you sign 10% as a listing contract, listing broker is getting 10%. They choose how they're going to split that. Now, buyer's agent says, I want $5,000. That's 10% plus $5,000, unless you choose as a listing agent to reduce that. So on the buyer's side, I feel like your buyer's not going to be aware of that. Your buyer doesn't know that.
Right.
You're correct.
And so that's coming back to them.
Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right, Morgan, because it says in addition.
Correct.
So Kathy and I were discussing this early this morning. And what you just brought up to me with 14 offers is what I told her this morning, was that we have to be careful whether you're the buyer's agent or the listing agent. If you're the listing agent, number one, you got to really study page 2 like you did, and good job. But also, when you have a multiple offer situation, you really have to fill out a seller's cost sheet on every one of those deals that are presented to you, because there's so many things happening in these deals now with commissions, concessions, transfer tax, all these different things. So you literally have to make sure you go through each and every offer and fill out a cost sheet and that it's accurate. Okay. Same thing on the buyer side, because what I was explaining, and whether anybody brings it up to me or not on this call, I know people are confused. I know you're confused. Okay. So if you just try to stop, don't panic, and think about it logically. If it's a concession on that page 2, if it's a concession, that means and there's no commission being offered, okay, that means that on the buyer side of the deal, you have to do a buyer's cost sheet showing what the concession is coming over to the buyer from the seller, whatever that amount is. So let's assume that that amount is 1.5%. And let's assume that your buyer agency is 3%. That means that you would need to, unless you're willing to accept the 1.5, that means that you would need to charge your buyer 1.5% in order to collect your full commission. Now, again, I don't want to confuse you, but when that 1.5% comes from the seller to the buyer on the buyer agency or the buyer closing cost sheet, you're going to show that as the concession. Okay. When you charge it to the buyer, the other 1.5, now on the settlement sheet, it's going to be paid on the buyer's side of the settlement sheet. If it was coming as a commission, it's going to be paid from the seller on the seller's side of the settlement sheet. So in this particular case, where you would have 1.5% coming from a concession, the settlement sheet will all be 100% on the buyer side. If it was, you could technically have part of it coming from the buyer and part of it coming from the seller. So if the commission that was offered was 1.5% and it wasn't in a concession category, it was in a commission category, and you still wanted to collect 3%, on the settlement sheet, there's going to be a column on the buyer side that we're going to charge the buyer 1.5%. And on the seller side of the settlement sheet, we're going to collect 1.5% of the thing. So just what I'm saying to you, and Seth and Aaron, hopefully you're both on this call, is we have to really be careful when we're sending these pre-HUDs out to not send them to our customers until we have reviewed them. Okay? We need to make sure these commissions and concessions are on the proper side of the settlement sheet of the HUD or the disclosure or whatever you want to call it these days, whether it's a cash deal or a finance deal, because we don't want to look like idiots by sending wrong information out. So it's very important that the title company has a double check system before they send it to the agent. It's important for Seth to check these settlement sheets before he sends them to the agents. And it's important for our agents to check these settlement sheets before they send them to the client. I'm telling you, this is going to get really confusing. Just like Morgan said, there's experienced agents that are having problems with this. I'm fielding calls every day with everybody's situations, most of which we've already talked about and have figured would happen. But all I'm trying to say is be careful, slow down, read it. If you don't understand it, call Brooks, call Kong, call me, call Aaron, call Seth, and let's figure this out before we send out any information. So it's important to check these settlement sheets. It's important to check when you have multiple offers to make sure you have sellers' cost sheets and buyer's cost sheets that are correct. It's also important, this conversation that I had this morning with Kathy, is that we make sure the lenders that are involved have it correct also. So when the lender is producing a buyer's cost sheet, they need to know whether or not there's a concession coming over and whether or not there's a fee being charged for the commission, as well as your brokerage fee, as well as the inspection fees. So these sheets from the lender need to be just as accurate as the sheets we prepare. And we've got to have a lot of communication with them because they're not initially going to come to us correctly. So, Kong, anything you want to add to that?
No, just double check your work and
Absolutely.
everybody else's work.
Tim, can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So on page 2 of the contract where it says seller's concessions, normally on a contract, so like the B part of that is closing costs help, which we're all familiar with. That comes as closing costs. If you fill it in as A, you're saying that the commission on the contract or on the closing sheet would go directly from seller to buyer's agent?
Are you talking on A? If it's A under the commission part, on the seller's, on the closing sheet, it's going to come from the seller side.
So it'll be a seller side paid to directly to, so if it was a co-broke, to me, it would come directly to RE/MAX First Advantage from seller. Yeah. Okay, so because that it's almost the same as like if you had a co-broke. Yes. So then, because I was asking that because I think in the lender call, and I could be wrong because I was, listening in on that they were talking about in addition, like the closing cost assistance, you could add that in addition, and it almost sounded like it was coming from the buyer side. But that's what I was reading it as. It would be on the seller side directly to the buyer. So it wouldn't be that. It could be the same as a co-broke. So if a lender had an issue with that, could you amend the contract at some point and do a co-broke and change your commission with the seller?
You could amend it and do that. But if you
it became an issue,
if you look at number A line, the second line, it says seller will pay the following fee to the broker for the buyer on behalf of the buyer at settlement.
Yeah, I was just wondering if just because I don't, again, like you said, lenders, some lenders are going to interpret this completely different than others. And so if that, or if somebody was already getting closing cost assistance and it was an excess amount to make that work. Because I mean, I'll be honest, I've seen now, and I'm like, this was kind of when this first came out, I kind of thought of how to propose this. And, having 14 offers still on a listing is much different than in a market that, you get one offer after, 6 weeks of market. So 14 offers, I almost wonder if it wouldn't be better to say, you write what you want on A in the contract and let's see what happens as, write your best offer to the seller.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I'm torn on that. I'm listing my in-laws' house, so maybe I'll play around with it, but
there's a lot of agents coming up with different scenarios in this new game. I had an agent call me the other day and ask me, well, can I just show the commission through the concession field of the listing agreement and in the MLS? And yes, you can. You can do that. You can put 2%, 3%, 2.5%, 25%, whatever you want, you can put in the concession field. Okay, not 25, but and then the agents will see that in the MLS. But what you have to remember is that's fine as long as the buyer doesn't need closing cost help that's going to exceed the lender's requirements. So hypothetically, if 2.5% was in the MLS as a concession, a negotiated concession, you have to make sure on your buyer's cost sheet then that you're putting that 2.5% in there from the seller and charging the buyer the 2.5% on their cost sheet, and then which in turn goes and is put on the settlement sheet. So We just have to, depending upon how it's laid out, work it, because there's no hard fast rule that you have to do it this way or you have to do it this way. You can do it either way as long as you have the details correct.
And part of the details is what you and your seller, the listing agreement says.
Mm-hmm.
So if your listing agreement with your seller says X amount, and then you offer a different amount, that's an ethics violation. So be careful.
Repeat that, Kong, just so everybody understands what you're, or let me simplify
All
what
right.
you're just saying.
If your
What Kong
listing
said is
agreement,
if you list a property for 6%, and on page 2 of the listing agreement, you're saying that you're going to offer cooperating compensation of 3%. Now take it from there. What you're saying is you can't change.
now, if one agent calls you and you say it's 1.5%, and then another agent calls you and you say it's 2%, and then a third agent calls you and you say it's 2.5%, and all three get a different amount, and somehow it comes back to you and people find out, that could be a major ethics complaint. So always go back to what your agreement with your seller is.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I had to call Kong over the weekend because I had a couple scenarios that I thought was very interesting. I had 25 showings over the weekend. I only received 3 offers. And I just want to clarify, when I'm receiving offers, what I'm supposed to be allowing. You know, I got pre-approval letters. Am I supposed to be requiring a buyer's agency agreement and a buyer's cost sheet? Because I didn't receive either one of them or a co-broke, but I had disclosed to everybody prior to showing that the seller was offering 2.5% commission. I still think it's important to call each buyer's agent and question and get more information about every buyer, because I learned things that were not disclosed to me without asking questions. One was that one buyer wanted to do a PHFA financing, which I don't know if anybody's been experiencing that lately, but they can be anywhere from 2, 3, 4 weeks behind. So that would have delayed settlement if he hadn't disclosed that to me. So I had to disclose it to the seller. One was a VA buyer who the agent did not disclose that their house is under contract and they have a cash offer, but he did not disclose that this was contingent upon sale of settlement. So I asked him if he had a VA loan on his current house and that he's getting a VA loan on the new house. And so the questions I thought, you have to ask because people aren't disclosing. And then I had a couple, you have to factor in a VA versus 20% down versus conventional. And then I had appraisal gaps between a bunch. So I'm running 2 different cost sheets for my sellers on every contract when there's appraisal gaps so that they can see if it appraises or doesn't appraise. I'm just curious, what exactly am I supposed to be asking for when an offer is submitted to me?
Okay. And it's not a requirement, according to Brett, that a buyer's agent needs to turn over the buyer agency agreement. Okay. But I congratulate you on asking questions, because to me, it's unbelievable that agents would submit an offer. Let's just say the VA offer that you talked about. Okay. And when you said that you submitted it as a cash offer, you probably meant that they submitted it.
No, I'm sorry. The house that they have a house to sell. It is under contract with a cash buyer.
With a cash
Therefore,
buyer.
they felt they did not need to make the sale contingent upon a settlement
Right.
of their house.
Now, my question would be, when you got the pre-approval letter from the lender. If you called and questioned a pre-approval letter, you probably called and questioned the agent. But if you were to call the lender and say, do they need to settle on this house in order to buy this home? And if the lender would have said yes, that's when we get pissed off at these lenders, because why wouldn't they have put that on their pre-approval letter? So that you'd have known, because apparently this agent never submitted a contingency that was contingent upon the settlement of that home, is what you're saying. You found out just by asking questions, right, Tracy?
Yeah, and maybe I'm wrong, but I always thought that if you currently have a house with a VA financing, you can't go ahead and buy another house with a VA financing. Maybe I'm wrong there.
No, I think you're correct on that. Number one, I think you're correct. But number two, these agents, knowing that deal needs to settle, should have told you the truth. And they didn't,
Tim, I can tell you that 3 of the 14 offers had sale and settlement contingencies, and 3 of the all 3 pre-approvals listed nothing about them selling their house.
Right. And it's just unbelievable that they'll send you a pre-approval as if they can buy it. But then when you get into this transaction, if that deal would have fallen apart, they'd have said, oh, we can't get financing now, our deal fell apart, which they never disclosed. I just think it's wrong for lenders not to put that on the pre-approval letter, but it's our job to question these things when these offers come in. Brooks, do you agree with that too?
Yeah, absolutely. That's common to see lenders kind of leave that off pre-approval letters. It's very frustrating for sure.
Brooks,
Yeah.
can you scroll to the finance page
Yeah.
I just wanted to see something real quick. Okay, start right there. Go back up slowly. Yep. So look at how this contract is laid out. Okay. Talks about buyer financing. And these are the 4 things that the buyer and seller will do or won't do, irregardless of if the contract was elected with a contingency, a mortgage contingency or not, right? You have to abide by these 4 rules here. Then B talks about the loan to value ratio. Okay. Next is this FHA VA box, right? It is expressly agreed that notwithstanding any other provisions in this contract, so nothing else in this contract matters. If you're getting a VA FHA loan, this matters. Okay. So
And that was left blank on my contract on the VA financing.
well, not less than the purchase price as stated in this agreement. So we haven't even gotten to the elected or waive yet, right? So all of this supersedes anything at the bottom. So if they're getting a VA and they waive the mortgage contingency, guess what? It still has to appraise.
Right. You're right on that.
Irregardless if they waived the contingency or not, it still has to appraise for the sales price or they can't buy it. And notwithstanding anything in the contract, it don't matter. They're getting their deposit back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just, I'm just telling you, that was one savvy agent that knows how to play the rules. Good for you for catching that, Tracy, and questioning him, because he knew what was going on.
But then if they have the appraisal contingency attached to that, like I had appraisal contingencies, but they weren't marked in the sales agreement. That'll supersede where they have the.
You don't need an appraisal contingency with a VA deal. That's the first thing it says on the appraisal.
It's automatic, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be used with an FHA or VA deal.
Thank you for that. I didn't catch that.
Because this supersedes everything, this box. That's why it's boxed in, folks. It's important, right? Anything that's boxed in is important in the contract and should be not taken lightly. I know we always skip through this and just see one blank there. And if there's a number there, great. If not, maybe we'll fill it in, maybe not, whatever, but it's super important.
Kong, if you want to give an example in general about an experience that an agent in our company had this week with regards to showing a property and not working out the commission ahead of time. But luckily it did work out because there was no co-broke form submitted or signed. Can you kind of explain that scenario?
Yeah, I think one of our agents, this happened right around August 16, 17, before Bright took away the numbers, the commission, the compensation numbers. So our agent saw it, a few days before, and it said 5%, let's say. And his compensation with his buyer is 6%. So he wanted to ask the extra 1%,
3%, right?
right, the extra percentage, but now the number went away from Bright. So we don't have anything in writing or to show for it, or a printout or anything. And our agent showed the house, wrote it up, got it executed, but there was no co-broke. So, and it wasn't on the contract either. So, luckily we were able to get a co-broke signed, and it was still that amount, but it wasn't the amount that he wanted. So in order to get that extra amount, you either had to negotiate it during the negotiation period, but now that it's after the fact and executed, now you got to go back to your buyer and enforce the buyer agency. So
We
that
just
was
really need to make sure we're getting the co-broke agreement or something in writing from the co-broke that they are agreeing to pay or not pay any sort of commission before you go show this house, right?
Yes.
There has to be some sort of understanding that they're going to pay or not going to pay, and what is that amount before you go out and show the house.
Absolutely.
Anybody confused on that at all? Please bring it up if you are. Don't be embarrassed, because we need to talk through these scenarios until you understand them. Because they are confusing. They're confusing to us too. You can't just ask us a question, we're going to absolutely know the answer. At this point in time, a lot of what we're going to need to do is you're going to have to send us a copy of what the papers say so that we can figure it out, with regards to page 2, with regards to the listing contract, with regards to the buyer agency contract. We're going to need to know what you have written in these things in order to be able to answer your questions.
Tim, what's acceptable communication as to what the commission is? Does it have to be a phone call, a text, an email? If we think we have an understanding, if you have a phone call and someone tells you what the commission is, there's no real proof of it other than you're taking their word for it. What if somebody says, "Oh, the commission's 3%," and then they turn around and say it's 2.5%, and that was on a phone call, and they're not being honest?
I think the best form of the communication would be to get the co-broke form first. The next best thing would be to get either an email or a text message in writing from the listing agent stating what they're willing to pay as a commission. At least we have something then. I agree with you, Joe. And not that we would accuse somebody of lying or making a mistake, but people do make mistakes, and they might say to you 3%, and the next thing you know, you find out it was 2.5% because they made a mistake. So at least if it's in writing, we can prove it. If it's verbal, we can't. So hopefully that answers that. The best thing would be to get the co-broke form. But to me, as long as you had a text message or an email stating what they're willing to pay, I think that's good too. Kong Brooks, do you agree with that?
100%. And
okay.
To reiterate again, always as a listing agent, You're paying out whatever you and your seller agreed to. Okay. Co-broking is not a time to seek out revenge on other agents that are not compensating enough. Because we are in a very small community, word travels around, people talk, and if there's inconsistencies in the payout, you will be sitting in front of the ethics board.
Well, you know, there's a lot going on in this industry right now, and some of these agents are taking this, what I feel is a small change, and making it a major change, where they're offering 0, they're offering 1, you know, they're offering 1.5, you know, they're and there's no standard to what's going on. It's like the wild, wild west out here all over again. So just do what's right, be very thorough, and cross your T's and dot your I's, and make sure you have it in writing as to what they're willing to pay and not willing to pay. And if they're not willing to pay, you have to have those hard conversations with your buyer that they are going to have to pay. And I know they're hard conversations that you're going to have with them that we didn't used to have to worry about having with them. But it's going to be something that needs to be done, because you are going to run up against these listings for a while that are going to have not normal type commissions. Brooks and I discussed this. I don't remember if it was yesterday afternoon or this morning. And Brooks, if you want to elaborate on that this will all change when the market changes. When the supply and demand changes, this will change too. So Brooks, could you talk a little bit about the conversation that we had about that?
Yeah, I mean, the seller in this market, I mean, for the past, what, about 8 years, has been in the absolute driver's seat in basically being able to dictate all the terms they want via competition over their listing, right? They get buyers to pay both sides of the transfer tax. In certain instances in competition, they were already paying their buyer's agent to make their offer more attractive. They're putting escalation addenda in place, not receiving any seller's concessions or closing cost help. Sellers were able to get away with these types of practices and, you know, get these types of offers simply because of supply and demand. There was zero supply and a lot of pent-up demand, a lot of buyers trying to buy the limited houses that were out there. Obviously, if we go back to a market where we, you know, used to see prior to like 2000, I guess, 18, or, you know, where there wasn't as many competitive multiple offer situations, things like sellers' concessions were common. That was a common practice. Obviously, if you need to work harder and the sellers need to make their houses more attractive and more attainable to the masses, you know, it's only going to be beneficial to them to offer some type of cooperating compensation, because there's no doubt about it, if the buyers are faced with yet another expense in a transaction, there's a large amount of buyers that aren't going to be able to afford it. So again, with a market shift, you know, it's my opinion that these things that you're seeing that sellers are able to get away with now will go by the wayside once the competition dries up.
Poppy, you want to add anything to what's happened today?
No, you guys are on it. It's a must be careful market in writing. Absolutely at the top.
Yep, just what he said. Be careful, take your time, look at all the offers that are coming in like Morgan did, create seller cost sheets for each one, make sure your scenarios of how the offers are written are accurate, make sure on the buyer's side, you have everything accurate with the lender and your fees. We just don't want to get into a situation where a buyer gets upset because they say we didn't disclose the fees. And then you get down to the end and there's a problem and they report you to the real estate commission and they come in and investigate. Just take your time and be accurate. And if you have any questions, call us. And then back to what Joe said with that scenario too, try to get something in writing, whether it's a text message, an email, or the compensation form, to make sure everybody has an understanding of whether you're going to get paid or not get paid, or how much you're going to get paid before you go out and show these listings. Okay. Anybody else have any other questions?
By the way, I think we're doing a wonderful job downstairs, because I've had showings on my listings all weekend, and I haven't had one agent call me and ask, since we're sending out that co-broke ahead of time. So thank you.
Yeah. Joe, it looked like you had a question.
I was just gonna say, sometimes it's just hard to get agents to even take a call or get a response, you know how it is.
Yeah.
You know, people just not being available.
Well, hopefully if they have listings, they're going to make themselves more available, because it's a little more effort that we have to put in to each transaction right now. So,
Right.
Yep.
Brooks,
Anybody else? Paula, you have something?
would it be possible to send out this policies and practices guide that you printed up?
Yeah, you're going to get it today. Yeah.
Great.
Yep. Yep.
One other thing, the thing that we're doing to notify agents of our listings, commission co-brokes, is that something that's been suggested to the whole MLS, or is this, just from our brain trust?
No, it just came from our brain mastermind meetings between Aaron, Seth, Kong, Brooks, myself. It came out of that. We are going to have again a call on August the 28th with the Board of Realtors, and I certainly will suggest or let everybody know what we're doing, and maybe they'll consider having the same sort of practice, which would definitely make life a lot easier for everybody.
Can I also confirm yay or nay on this? So when I receive an offer, I'm supposed to receive a co-broke, a buyer's cost sheet, and a buyer's agency agreement?
I don't think it's a requirement that you receive the buyer agency or the buyer's cost. That's the buyer's agent's problem that they need to deal with their buyer. According to Brett in our meeting, there's no requirement for the buyer's agent to turn over their buyer agency to you.
Okay. Just want to confirm that. Thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a good question, Tracy, because I thought it would be a good idea to turn those things over. But according to, that meeting we had with Brett, he did not see that there's any reason why we have to.
Mm-hmm.
Because I actually thought that should go to the title company too. So the title company is aware of these changes. Like I said, Seth's got to be careful. The title companies have to be careful. This is the operations are a little bit different than they were before. And these are important and very large transactions. And we have to do our job. The settlement department needs to do the job, and the title company needs to do the job and make sure that this information is accurate before it goes out to a buyer or a seller. Okay, well, without any other questions, if anybody has it, Brooks, good job on the policies and procedures and the updated information. We'll get that out to everybody. And
real quick, do you want to go over, I know you were talking about this form, this bright disclosure for all subscribers.
Yeah, why don't we do that one
next week?
Yeah, because we've already accumulated an hour here.
Yeah.
let's, if we can just give a synopsis of it, you can, Brooks or Kong, you can talk about, there's been information distributed through Bright MLS about fines that could be implemented in the event that you don't have the Bright MLS forms filled out, that Sherry Anderson had brought up to us a while back. And, you know, we're going to go over that more next week. Brooks, Kong, is there one specific form, or are there multiple forms that are in this? Just
Sounds like I think there's only one right now, because
Okay.
it's for
And
both. It just says client on it, so it's for buyer and
we've added it to our global package, Brooks,
Yes. Yeah.
in the zip forms, so that it comes up as an automatic form to get filled out when you're working with a buyer or seller. And like I said, we'll go through that form more next week. But, you know, Bright is insisting that this has to be filled out and in the file. And if it's not, and they find out about it, there could be a fine of up to $1,000, I think it is.
Yeah, without warning, I think the
Yeah.
verbiage says, yeah.
Okay. Anybody have any questions on that? If not, we will see you next week.